Tim, let's get this thing moving.
Here we go.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much for your patience. We were having a little bit of technical difficulty. That's never fun to have.
Every time, right? Every time this has to happen, doesn't it?
I know. It's, we've been doing this a lot lately, and it's been working fantastic, but something went awry on my side.
And if you don't, Bobby, if you don't tell anybody you're going to go live on YouTube, if you just sneak in, nothing bad happens. But if you tell anyone, this is what happens every time.
I know, bro. It's like, but Tim, our executive producer,
yes,
it's never his fault. I think I just frustrate that out of him because he can just see what a unsavvy tech dude that I am.
Yeah, but he is your God King, brother. Without him, you would be nothing, Bobby. Okay, so I hope you are, whatever your fame as you're approaching, I hope you always have him at your hip because you need that guy. Okay, Tim's your savior there. So
absolutely. Well, my guest is my dear friend J. Warner Wallace, and we today are going to be talking about just some of the issues that we have been seeing on the news as of late. And I reached out to Jim recently and said, hey, I would love to get your feedback as it relates to questions like, are all cops racist? Which the obvious answer is no. Should we defund the police? What is Jim's thoughts on that? But Jim, I thought it would be good as a means of introduction for our audience. I'm sure everybody is familiar with you, but in the event they're not, why don't you just kind of tell us a little bit how you got into being a detective and your background in this. And then after that, what we'll do is we'll begin to talk a little bit about maybe the way you've seen this evolve from the early days. Are the questions a lot different?
Can you tell Bobby? Apparently Bobby thinks I have earlier days based on my appearance today.
Yeah, and you used to have long hair, right? I mean, you were undercover.
I used to have hair that was like your color. I think I was 12. Right. Okay.
But it looks good on you, Santa.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's true.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my background is that I came up in a cop family. My dad worked in this job from 1961 until I hired on in 1988. I worked 25 years in the job. My son hired on. He's been there about 8 years now. So we've got 3 generations of police officers in Southern California. I work in Los Angeles County. And we all have the same name. So we've kind of experienced what that is to be in that age and we have different experiences based on the generation in which we worked. When I stopped toward the end of my career, I worked nothing but cold cases. And that kind of started me on a path. I was not a Christian until I was already in my career for about 9 years. And I became a Christian, kind of investigating the Gospels like a cold case, and ended up writing a book. And then that kind of took me in a different direction. I was, at the same time, I was working as a police officer, as a detective. I also was attending seminary, and then I got a seminary degree, and I started pastoring a church. And when I wrote the first book, we stopped, and I've now just been traveling and making the case for Christianity. And this is one of those issues that I very seldom, Bobby, and I think you know me well enough to know that I stay in my lane. I talk about this all the time when we train up other apologists. I have a narrow lane, right? I have a master's degree in architecture, but I don't have a PhD. I have a master's degree in theology, but I don't have a PhD in something that I would say would make me like an expert in certain areas. I just know how evidence works in a trial, how it works in court, how we assemble cases, what counts, what doesn't count, what's persuasive, what isn't persuasive. And I stay in that lane, and I make the case on our website's coldcasechristianity.com. And I make that case, is the Bible true? And should we take it seriously? That's my lane. And I've always felt like those issues are upstream from any other cultural issue. So for example, where we're divided as a country, I could spend time, there's 15 issues we're divided on, and I could start posting videos and blogs and articles and, podcasts on those 15 areas where we divide. But it turns out that the issue that's upstream is, do we all hold the same Christian worldview? No. Do we all think the Bible is telling us the truth? No. Those of us who do think the Bible is telling us the truth, do we take it seriously enough not to parse out one verse or one passage to twist it for whatever theology or whatever case we're trying to make? No. So I think if we actually, number one, believed that the Bible was true, and number two, took it seriously, we'd agree on a lot of those 15 things that are downstream.
Yeah, that's so true.
So I just, I remember we did it was just last week's premiere. We premiere our stuff on Wednesdays at noon on YouTube, and we had a premiere, and somebody asked me, why is it, you don't write a lot about issues of race? Well, because I always say, you could easily have said, why don't you write a lot about homosexuality? Or why don't you write a lot about same-sex marriage? Or why don't you write a lot about abortion? I always say the same thing. All I do is write about that stuff. I'm just writing about it 2 or 3 steps upstream, because I think all of it comes back to our sin nature. And do we trust that this is God's word? Mm-hmm. And if we do, we'd have to at least bend our knee to it. So that's really where I've been focused all this time. But I think now, because of what's happening, I probably spend more time talking about this issue, not because I have expertise as somebody, a Black person in America who's got an entirely different experience than me, but because I'm on the other part of the equation, the cop side of it. And people ask me these questions all the time. I'm happy to answer them, but I will tell you, I'll warn you all tonight that I'll probably make all of you mad because what I learned a long time ago is when we say we want to bridge a divide, what we really mean is we want all of you guys to come over to our side. Mm-hmm. We don't mean we want to walk across that bridge toward each other, because if we're going to do that, that means we're going to have to, because there's rules for bridge crossings. The first rule, no one crosses a bridge without leaving their edge. Mm-hmm. Sorry. If you want to cross a bridge, you're going to have to leave something that you hold dear at that edge. Mm. You can't just say, no, you leave all your stuff and come over here. Right. That's not quite how this is going to work. And so when I talk about these things publicly, both sides at some point want to choke me. Okay. So just know that's probably where this is headed.
Okay. So Jim, before we talk about maybe some of the compromises that need to be made in order to walk across the bridge, some of the things that we need to give up, you do come from a lot of years of experience in the police force. What has been some of the line of work? I mean, SWAT team, undercover detective, what are some of the different things? I mean, even for our listeners, for them to know, I mean, I think you have been brought on more than any other detective that I'm aware of on Dateline News. Yeah. You had a very, very great career in law enforcement.
I mean, I think I've had a lot of police officers have, because what's great about this job is it never gets old. It never gets boring, because every couple of years you can change assignments and you can do all kinds of great things that are fun to do. And I had a chance to do that, right? I worked patrol, I worked SWAT, I worked undercover, I worked gangs, I worked a street dope team called Metro Team, and I worked robbery homicide, I worked intelligence, and then I worked about 10 years working cold cases. There's unsolved murders. And we were down the road, not that far down the road from Universal Studios. So NBC Universal. So we ended up on Dateline more than I think than any other detective in the country, which doesn't mean that much, but it just means that, hey, we're close to NBC Universal. They can get a case without traveling across the country. We're going to do that for sure. So that's probably why that happened. But my point is, the one thing I didn't do is promote. But I did watch my peers promote. But when they were studying for the sergeant's exam, I was studying in seminary. I spent 9 years getting through my seminary degree because I was working full time. Mm-hmm. And to do 70 units when you're working full time, and there's no like breaks, and this is like they're not going to give you an easy unit. I was like, oh my gosh, it took me forever, and I just didn't promote. And I also loved what I was doing. I didn't want to stop being a detective and start supervising detectives. But I will tell you that a lot of what we're seeing in our culture right now in terms of law enforcement is going to come down to, and I used to spend a lot of time, the last 2 years I was at my agency, I was asked for our agency. Mm-hmm. Now think about that for a second. Not every agency has an in-house ethics program. Sometimes you'll hire somebody on the outside to do that. But the fact that you think you need an ethics program tells you that there's a need for teaching ethics, even to officers who have been there for a long time. And it's not that what we're really focused on 99% of the time is some abuse of force. Right. It's often just the stuff that gets everyone in trouble, regardless of whatever industry they're in. It's that people will steal. Yeah, you'd think these are police officers, but that's just the fallen sin nature we have. People will lie. People will do so. It's all those kinds of things that you have to kind of help your officers through. It's not always that you think, well, it's going to be another George Floyd kind of event. Sometimes it's something that's much lesser, but still, there has to be zero tolerance. Now, every agency is different, but there has to be zero tolerance. So that's a lot of where I'm coming from, is that, I worked all those spots. And then as my friends promoted, that's why I got asked to do the ethics program, because the guy who was the chief was a friend of mine who was an officer when I was an officer. All the captains were my buddies that they promoted. 25 years in, I didn't promote. But they knew that I might be able to talk about the need to do the right thing from a biblical perspective without ever using the B word, right? So I was just focused on trying to teach biblical ethics to people who by and large they rejected the Bible. So I needed to be able to find another way to teach that.
So, I think that your experience, number one, with all the different areas that you've served, and gives you a unique perspective into just the sacrifice of our officers. And I'm sure you've seen the underbelly as well, and that's what will make your thoughts informative. Not only that, being a Christian who is passionate about ethics and wanting to see right and wrong. And now you've been an officer as an atheist, you've been an officer as a Christian. What is your perspective on what is happening in our culture right now as it relates to law enforcement, maybe compared to what you experienced when you were active in duty throughout the years?
Well, I think that so let me just say something up front. Nobody hates a dirty cop more than a good cop. Nobody wants that jerk out of the profession faster than the guys who end up being represented by that behavior. So I will tell you that I have I hate to say it, but I kind of have the same tolerance for this that you might have for a pastor. Let me tell you my view on pastoring has been. You have those qualifications, right, in 1 Timothy and Titus, where Paul talks about the qualifications for deacons, elders, for leaders. And I think I have a zero tolerance. If you break one of those, if you fail in one of those areas, of course you're still part of the church. Of course you're still part of the family of God. But I would say you're no longer qualified for leadership. And I'll be honest with you. I don't know. I don't think you can be restored to the family of God, but I would never restore you to a position of leadership.
Yeah.
That's a zero tolerance position I take, because I think that the role of leading in the church has to be the highest bar possible. I have a similar bar for police officers. I know that sounds terrible, but I think that because this is how I pitch it. I'm going to say the first offensive thing, okay, that most people get upset with me about. This idea that the law enforcement is a monolithic institution. It's not. It's not. So in Los Angeles County, there's, I think, over 30 municipal agencies, aside from LAPD and the LA County Sheriff's Department. Each one of these agencies has an entirely different ethos, command staff, chief, set of experiences, citizens, part of the county. Is it suburban, more urban? There's all different kinds of character that's across the entire. This is a huge basin of people. It's as big as most countries are in Europe, okay? And it has a wide variety, and there is not a lot of uniformity. Now, we can argue that maybe that's what needs to happen, is we need to have more uniformity between agencies. But I can tell you, as it is now, you can't get two chiefs to agree on some of these issues. So it's not like you can say, hey, there's a system in place, and you're talking about all of law enforcement, because it's so fractured in terms of the hiring standards are different. The way the officers relate to the citizens are different. It depends. And by the way, sometimes that's as different as we have no space between our cities. So if you're in the South Bay, for example, and you're in Manhattan Beach or Hermosa Beach or El Segundo, or you're in Hawthorne or Lomita or Torrey, these are small. And what separates them is just that if you're on this side of the street, you're in one city. If you're on that side of the street, you're in another. And the jurisdiction of the cops stops at those lines. So it's such a fractured, but here's the thing I'm going to say that's going to be offensive. The one thing I taught my guys, and I think this is true. Are you ready? Law enforcement is the one necessary profession upon which all other professions are contingent. The one necessary profession. Here's why it's not. What I'm not saying is that law enforcement, the way it is today, or the way it is in your city, is the one. I'm saying as an overarching industry, as an overarching institution, if you can't secure the peace and safety of a community, you can't have doctors because someone's going to come in and shoot that guy for a bad diagnosis. You can't have accountants because someone's going to come in and steal their money. You can't be in certain parts of a city and open a business because you may have a problem in that part of the city. It turns out that the one thing you need is a well-functioning, fair, and just institution in place that can provide safety and order. Now, if you're saying, well, whatever you're doing in law enforcement is not getting that done, okay, fine, that's another debate. But the idea that you could do away with an institution that first lays the foundation for safety and for freedom, that's probably a silly notion. For example, in California, if you look at the history of California, I think it was formed in, I want to say it was in 1860, 1830. Well, if you look at every single county and when they formed, they all formed on the same day. And if you look at go look at the county sheriffs, exact same day. It turns out the first thing you put in order in any small town in the West is the deputy, is the sheriff, because you can't have, without the sheriff there, you have no way to even build and know that it's not going to get burned to the ground. You just need that in place first. Now, what this does not mean is you're at the top of the pecking order. In fact, you're just the opposite. You're the foundation of civilization. And that means, like any foundation in a building, you get ignored. You get walked on all the time. No one thinks about their foundation of their house. They walk on it all the time. The dog pees on it. People don't care about it because that's the foundation. And you have to be willing to accept. Now, here's why this is important. If you're the one necessary profession, you better have a standard that is above everyone else's. There is no tolerance for bad behavior. And I don't think you can restore people who have been convicted of a bad behavior, and nor should you. And this is why I tell my guys all the time, we have this unbelievable privilege to work in the one necessary profession. But here's what it's going to require of you. You have to be invisible, the invisible foundation that holds up the house, that is going to be maligned and ignored and abused because nobody cares about their foundation. But you do know in the end, you are part of the one necessary profession. Doesn't make it better than other professions. It just means that you have to have this done well and in place before you can have anything else. And that raises the bar super high for us, as it should be.
What do you think the message is as you're listening, as somebody who's a detective? Because I don't really have my hands around what it would even mean to defund the police when I hear that kind of language, because I do tend to think that there does need to be, some structure to police morality, obviously. I hate, just as you do, what happened to George Floyd. I mean, that was right. It was ridiculous. I mean, I would stand with any African American and say that was horrific what happened to that individual, and I hate it, and I know you do. And by the way, I want to say, Jim, I appreciate what you were saying, that nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop.
Yeah, right.
Because I can relate to that as it relates to being in the ministry. It's like nobody gets more frustrated by corrupted ministers more than those who are trying to do the good thing, because you have to end up getting lumped into that and cleaning that up, and that makes it really difficult. It's interesting though, because I get confused, because I don't think people are saying that all cops are bad cops, but it seems like there's been such an emphasis lately with the far left to defund the police, and I'm going, well, what would that even look like? What do you think they mean by that? What's the alternative?
Well, I don't think they necessarily mean to eliminate the institution. I think people will sometimes say we need to defund the police, and what they really mean, I'm sure that some people actually mean completely destroy the police departments. But I think in the end, everyone recognizes, even when you see experiments like the experiment in Seattle for a couple of weeks there, where, at some point you realize you're going to have some either self-policing entity. And then when you have a cataclysmic event, it turns out you do need well-trained, brave first responders to get in there and take care and get people out and rescue people and all of that stuff. So you are going to have something in place. I think a lot of people, when they use that expression, what they really mean is this agency here that we've got these grievances against this agency. And if it's going to continue like that, then we want to eliminate it. What we want is something that's different. Because in the end, there's only been a couple of experiments. There's one thing, was it in Connecticut or New Jersey, where they defunded their police department. Then, of course, they had to get the state involved. And I think the state agencies came in, and they actually have more uniformed personnel now doing the job than they had before. That's because it's really hard. Look, these are voids in leadership, and they will always be filled by something. And so what you need to do is I would say, the idea is this is so far beyond reform that we could never, I'm not convinced of that yet. I'm not, only because I know it's tempting to look at individual events. Let me say one thing before we go any further on that, because I think this is an important point. But you just said something about ministers. Here's my fear. My fear is, I feel the same way you do when I see somebody who's abusing pastoral power. I wonder though, I'm so upset about how that makes us look as pastors, but I wonder if I stop having the kind of empathy I ought to have for the sinner or for the victim. So look, I want to be righteously indignant and righteously upset about what happened to George Floyd. But sometimes I find myself being more mad that officer puts us in this position where we all are judged now by that behavior. So that's a selfish reason, right, to be upset. I got to check that and say, well, wait, hang on. Are you willing to just grieve with those who are grieving first? Or is this just so selfish that you're just upset because you look bad now as a police officer? We have to kind of check that. Now, I will say this. There's a movement that happens on social media, and social media exacerbates it, that we don't see each other as individuals. That we see each other as groups, as tribes, really. And we talk about tribes and social media tribes. That's why I'm using that word. This idea that I have followers, you have your tribe, I have my tribe. This has been described on social media. Well, that's not helpful, and that's not healthy, because God does not see us in large groups this way. He does not look at the outward appearance of a man, but looks at the inward state, the condition of his heart. What it doesn't say in this passage in the Old Testament is that he looks at whatever family he came from and or whatever group he belongs to, and he judges them that way. No, instead, he looks at the individual's heart. Now, what happens is the more we see each other as tribes, the more tribal we become. The more we see each other as groups, the more racist we become, or the more upset with the other group we become. We end up thinking, here's what happens. You see a group, you see someone do something like what happened to George Floyd, and you think, okay, there you go. That's what I'm talking about. That's how police officers are. There are 800,000 plus police officers working. Do you honestly believe? Now, what you're doing is you're treating the entire group as a group. And of course, you're going to be upset that's the case. The first time you see another member of that group, you assign the intent to that member that you saw in that one guy. It happens in both directions, right? Because what happens is you watch the protests, and then one of these turns into a fire, and then you're thinking, see how those people are? Really? Okay, we do the same thing in reverse. We do the same thing on both sides. We have a tendency to assign to the group whatever bad behavior we see on the part of any member of the group. I don't think that's a helpful way to discuss this. For example, the last couple of days, Veda Hedgeman, who you both know, he's an apologist from Los Angeles County. He grew up in Compton, young black millennial. I love the fact that not only we have the racial difference, we also have an age difference. So I get to see how millennials think a little bit, which is cool. And my own son is his age, so it's kind of cool to kind of be able to talk. And we have a very different approach on this issue. Why? Because we know each other. I know his family. I know his girls. I have been to his church. He's met my mom while I was at her town speaking at a church. We know each other on a relational basis. And because we have that relationship, I think it changes the way we deal with each other. I cannot, and I could never lump people into groupthink that I know individually as humans. And that's where what happens on your social media is you don't know these people on Twitter who are banging on you. You're the nail and they're the hammer. You don't know those people. And so what you do is you have a tendency to think in group dynamics. And that is not helpful for this discussion, because what happens is we're just going to increase our polarization and increase our cynicism toward each other. the more we treat each other as large groups instead of as individuals.
I think that is such an important point. I mean, I see that happening as well. I mean, especially like after 9/11, we had this happening with Muslims, like all Muslims are bad. And it's like, no, not all Muslims are terrorist Muslims. Not all Muslims belong to ISIS. Right. And I think we show our lack of intelligence in a lot of ways. It's an unsophisticated statement to make this big, macro statement that, all cops are bad, all ministers are bad, all Muslims are bad. It's just not the case. And so I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think if we could learn to listen to each other and hear each other's hearts. I mean, that's the thing. Like when a pastor, for example, I'm just thinking about my own occupation, or I would imagine a doctor, when somebody commits medical malpractice, a good doctor's going to not tolerate that. And I would imagine an attorney, when he hears that, somebody just corrupted the system, or a car salesman that just rips somebody off. Like there are people that are good car salesmen, right? But unfortunately, it has a bad taste. And so we caricature everybody. And I like that you're helping us to not
think about this for a second, Bobby. We talked about that bridge crossing, right? The thing you're going to have to leave behind is this idea that you can judge everyone on the basis of the behavior of any small portion of that everyone. Yeah. Because both sides will do this. All cops are racist. Okay? Yeah. Are there racist cops? Now, the first thing you have to do to get away from the groupthink is to be honest and own up to the truth statements that involve individuals. Because this does not mean it affects you as the group. There's a fear, I think, to say, well, no, there's no racist cops, because you're afraid that just makes all of us. No. Are there racist cops? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, are you stupid? Sorry, there are.
Yeah.
Are there racist pastors? Yeah. Okay. Now, does this mean, though, that every cop, you'd have to go back to groupthink to do that? That's why what happens is you'll see that protesters are screaming at a cop who's standing out of line. And you know why he's standing there? Because he's been ordered to stand there. Do you think he wants to be there that day? No, he's like, please, can I do anything to get out of this? Because he's going to be yelled at by somebody, right? Mm-hmm. And that person has no idea what his story is, who he is, where he's coming from. The claim is just, if you're in that uniform, you're part of the group. Mm-hmm. And you don't know, and by the way, whatever you might have experienced at your agency in Minneapolis can be very different than if you're living in Burbank and Burbank PD is your police officer, your police agency. A much smaller agency dealing with a lot different kind of people, a lot different kinds of problems, a lot different kinds of community. Who knows what they're like? They're very different. You cannot judge. And so then what happens is if you all join together, and now I got Burbank PD on the streets of LA because they needed more bodies, you have no idea who you're talking to and where he's or she's coming from. And again, you'd have to start thinking like, now what the other side does is it says, well, if all of you weren't committing so many crimes, you wouldn't be in contact with the police. Really? Do you know the statistics for officers involved in bad behavior? They are surprisingly low, because it can't be judged on the number of officers. It has to be judged based on the number of contacts with the public. Mm-hmm. Do you know what percentage of the Black community is actually involved in crime? It would shock you to see how low it actually is. Mm-hmm. Here's what's happening is you're looking at those few officers who mess up and those few people who go to jail, and you're saying you're all like that.
Yep.
That's the thing you're going to have to leave at the edge. Mm-hmm. Now you can say, well, your percentage is higher than mine. Oh, really? Shut up. You're still group thinking, everybody.
Yeah.
It's a stupid argument to have. Instead, remember, you're going to have to recognize that you can't nut pick. It's called nut picking. I find the nuts and I assign all of you, I pick out the nuts and you're all like them. Remember, you got to stop nut picking and realize you got your own nuts. You've got your own nuts in your group. So you better get over that. And if you can do that, you can start to step toward each other as individuals.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about that. I mean, here's some things that I hear you acknowledging. Hey, Bobby, not everybody is a racist cop, but there is racism that needs to be addressed. Not every cop is corrupt, but there is corruption. And you hate the fact that there is corruption there.
Yes.
So now here we are. I mean, if you switch back and forth, which I do, I'll be on MSNBC. I'll go over to Fox. I just want to hear the different narratives that our culture is getting. And I go, it's unbelievable. And I'm just sitting there going, what can I honestly just try to just, how can I be as compassionate and listen without compromise? And so here, this is what we're talking about. What are some of the compromises that we can make? Because when I'm looking at the culture, like it almost looks like come quickly, Lord Jesus, or we're just absolutely going to crumble as a nation. It feels like,
well, a couple of things. This happens on occasion because it must. It must, because racism is not going away. And I'll tell you why it's not going away. It's a reflection. It's a small presentation of a much larger issue, which I call otherism. We all are otherists. You might say, I'm not a racist. Well, you're an otherist. Trust me, because that's part of our sin nature. It's the basis of our sin nature. In other words, we've got studies, scientific studies, that demonstrate that you are far more likely to hang out with, be drawn toward, marry people who are similar to you in their personality profiles, in their educational levels, in their interests, even in their DNA. Mm-hmm. This has been well documented. What that means is you kind of shun and reject and step away from people who are different than you. This is true for everyone. I recognize that when I first talk about this in a talk I do called Bridging the Thin Blue Line, I first really hit me as I was showing my Glock, which is the handgun I use, because my German family wanted to know, my wife's family wanted to know, what kind of weapon are you using? And I showed them my Glock, and they said, it's junk. That's Austrian. Okay, you realize that there's a line. They live about 30 miles above that Austrian border. I mean, you can't, from my perspective, I can't, they look the same on both sides. They almost speak the same kind of language. Schwäbisch is a kind of a dialect of German. I mean, really, they eat the same foods. They wear the same clothing. They dance the same dances. These are the line that's been there since World War II. Honestly, you're dividing because you're on one side of the line or the other when you pretty much look the same. Culturally, you're the same. By the way, this happens in gang maps also. When I work gangs, we have a map that shows where the Crips and Bloods live, and we know what the dividing lines are. And sometimes in that other neighborhood, your cousin lives over there. But no, he's wearing red, you're wearing blue. You divided from family based on a line in the dirt. We all do this. Mm-hmm. I suggest that if we all had the exact same racial color, same ethnicity, same height, we were all the same sex, we had the exact same look, we would still find a way to divide. We'd say, well, you live on the even side of the street. I live on the odd.
Say that again, Jim, because I think that's an interesting statement.
Well, we will find something to divide over. Otherism is so deep that if I could remove all the things that are different about everybody, including, so we're just like the same, whatever color you want. We're all the same, like the Blue Man. Remember that old Blue Man crew that used to be in Vegas, right? Everyone was painted blue and they'd shave their heads. Okay, let's say we're all blue with shaved heads. Yeah. You'll find something else to divide over. Oh, you wear your socks differently. You tie your shoes differently. I mean, we will divide over that rigidly. Because that is our nature as otherists. You're not going to get rid of that. That's the second thing you're going to have to walk away from. Realize that you're an otherist. And you got to own that. But you ever noticed people's wedding pictures? They are pretty much monochromatic. If you're in an Asian wedding, you pretty much have an Asian audience. Yeah. And if you're in it's true. Why do we do this? We are more likely to seek people who we feel comfortable. There's even a study out there that shows that you are more likely to hang out with people and to marry people who share your facial expressions. We will just find ways to seek people who are like us. And that's because we are prideful, fallen people. I like me. I don't like them so much. So I'm going to find someone who's like me because I like me. That's a pride issue, okay? And that's the nature of the fall. And that's the nature of why we do this. And once you realize that, you'll realize, hey, we got a problem. Now, that's the general problem. We also have a specific problem in America that is exacerbated by our history. And I know that. But I want to stay, I'm not probably going to be able to give you the best advice on what we should do on a big system. I know this, you're not going to fix this problem with government. It starts with a GO, but it's not government, it's gospel. You fix this with gospel. That's the only way to fix this. But I will say there are some things that I think I would probably do in law enforcement to go forward, and they're pretty straightforward. Look, you're showing this right now live on YouTube, or maybe sometimes people will go live on Facebook. Okay, so you're on Facebook. You have a Facebook. I have a Facebook page. I always say it this way: there are 3 things you do in order to start a Facebook page to make sure it doesn't go south. Number 1, you have a requirement, like who's going to get on this page. Not everyone's going to be allowed on the page. If they hate Bobby and they're just there to make fun of Bobby, you're probably not going to be on that page for very long. 2, you have rules about how you engage with each other on that page. And 3, you have a moderator who makes sure people actually stick to the rules. Well, a good agency does the same 3 things. right? We take time to make sure we take the right people are in the organization. That's number one. That's hard. We can talk about that. That's hard. Two, we have rules and training to make sure that once you're here, you do the right thing. And then third, we moderate. And I think we do a pretty poor job of moderating usually. In other words, we don't, nobody wants to be micromanaged. No officer wants to have a sergeant respond to every single call he gets dispatched to, right? It's like there's a certain sense, hey, don't look at my show. I can, don't trust me. Yeah. And so you see that those officers then promote to sergeant, and they felt that way as an officer. They're less likely to be, nitpicking their officers. And so it's hard, right? It's hard to figure out, well, how do I moderate? How do I monitor behavior without being ever present and destroying the morale of my guys? So it's not easy, but I think those are the three areas that I think we have to look at and say, if there's going to be reform, it's going to have to be in one of those three areas.
Okay, or all three, yeah. But you're kind of acknowledging something that we could begin to dialogue around, that you could put in place some specific plans in each of these three areas that could then allow us to have some measurables to see how we're doing. I mean, I've heard statements that the entire police force was put in place to, kind of govern the African-American slaves. And when I've heard that, I definitely would say like some of the foundational things about our country is horrific. Like, I hate that Washington and Jefferson had slaves. I hate that the White House and the Capitol were built by slaves. I hate that, that we had slaves, that women weren't able to vote until, the time period that they did. And I hate the segregation that we had taking place 60s. I hate all that. I mean, because my worldview says that there's one human race, that we're all equal before God. And I recognize that what my worldview, Christian worldview, there's equality, yet I realize that we do live in a culture where there is some structural things that have caused a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. I do find myself going, okay, we could really blow everything up, and I'm going to change the state name of Washington, change the name of Columbus, Ohio, and call it something else, tear down the White House. And I go, it's like, I just feel like what can we do to reform as a country, to forgive, to move on, to love, to acknowledge, but not blow everything up completely and wear ourselves out on that, because then we would have to go, because here's the last thing I'd say, Jim. My fear is, okay, then we start doing like racism is horrific. And if we're going to target that, then, well, what are we going to go over to other sins and go, well, everybody associated with murder, everybody associated with this, everybody associated with this. And what we're trying to do is eradicate something that only God can do through Jesus, and that's deal with our sin nature. Well,
we can certainly, I can understand why we might want to try any outward effort through law will not change the inward heart.
Right.
For example, I'm worried now that, I want to be able to address the long-term trajectory issue related to racism. I see steps in that, right? If you look about where we were 100 years ago, where we were 50 years ago, where we were 25 years ago, you can see steps in this issue, how we've dealt with it. I don't want to see that stop. Now, I think we're in a special time right now that we don't realize how special it is. Here's why I say that. My dad was in Los Angeles County working as a police officer during the summer riots, the Watts summer riots in the 60s. I was working under Rodney King and the verdict that came back afterwards. My son is there now working these protests, so we've all had an experience here, okay? This is a long-term trajectory that we need to get better and get better and get better and get better over time. But this is an unusual event in the sense that different from when my dad worked and different than when my son is working now and when I was working, because we happen to be at the end of about 6 weeks being locked down and told we could go nowhere. You can't even go to the beach without a mask. But if you want to go out to protest, you can go out. And you saw all kinds of folks who were using that in a different way than it was probably intended as a protest, right? Because they've been locked up for 6 weeks under the COVID lockdown. And now they have the ability to go out. Number two, 40 million people were out of work. And every event that was scheduled to happen got canceled. So people were available. And number three, they had been thinking, when you're when you're working 60 hours a week supporting your family, you're probably not on Twitter looking at social media for those 60 hours. So now you had a chance to fester over these. And Twitter, all Twitter does, all social media does, is to bring things into a boil, constantly keep it at a boil. So those three things were unique to this set of events that weren't even true 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when the Dallas shootings occurred. You could easily have had a right to protest, even during that string of events in that year, whatever year that was. But it didn't happen that way as it happened now, because this is all the stars were aligned for this kind of here's why I worry about it. We're in a culture that has a very sharp incline and a very sharp decline in public interest in anything. So, for example, when I was a kid, there was a thing called a click-clack. It was two balls on a piece of string, and you would click them back and forth, right?
I remember that.
Yeah, right? I mean, I'm ancient, okay? But that was like, it took probably a year for everyone to see that thing, to get it on advertising, to get it on TV, to get it in all the stores, and then like about 6 months to ramp down. So you got a chance to do something for 18 months if you're trying to hype an event or hype something back then. To be honest, you're 2 weeks into something now, everyone's got fatigue, informational fatigue. Why is this country past? You realize the COVID's worse right now than it was at the peak in March, okay? We have more and more deaths every day. But as a country, we're like, oh, no, I don't care. I'm already fatigued about that issue. I'm already over it. Do you want people to treat racism that way too? My fear is that what's happening now is that we're going to have, this is a long-term project that we need to work consistently and steadily at. We don't need to peak and then be disinterested altogether in a month. And that's kind of the cycle of information age, is that my fear is that you can't do long-term projects in the short-term click-dependent social media era in which we live.
Yeah.
Because then what happens, you get fatigued, and then suddenly you're not talking about it anymore, and everyone's like, now they're even more upset.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that there's going to be a kind of a more insidious otherism that's going to take place once this is all in everyone's rearview mirror and they don't care about it anymore. We can't get to that point where we get complacent. We have to be interested in the things of God, and that has to go long. That's the stuff that we should take our entire lives being interested in the things of God, not just the information cycle that we're in right now in social media.
Yeah, and I think even communication, Jim, is such an important aspect. I think we need to be stressing more as apologists on just tasteful communication. I mean, I'm even looking over to the news feed off to the side of our conversation as is going on right now, and I'm thinking some of these people have no idea how to communicate. I mean, they're rude with each other.
You're being judgmental.
Yeah.
This is your audience, okay, knucklehead. Yeah. This is your audience that you have raised up to be this way.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying I don't like when we're just so rude with each other, right? Like we need to be able to let people have an opinion, let people share. And I think that's what saddens me, is when I see such sharp criticism on news channels and everywhere you go and social media. Anybody can sit behind their screen and just play tough guy or tough girl and just lash out at each other. But all we're doing is infuriating each other, triggering one another, making us feel like we don't even have the freedom to speak honestly without being shut down. How important is it that we're going to learn how to communicate?
Well, what I see is, and I had to kind of figure this out, right? Because I wasn't spending a lot of time. I mean, I'm a boomer. I haven't spent a lot of time. I'm not a digital native like my kids are, or like the Gen Z is for sure. I'm a digital immigrant. I came to this later. I had to figure out, like, at this point in life, my first responsibility is to my bride, and that she comes first. And I don't want to be possessed. My headspace cannot be filled up with a lot of negativity. And what I've learned in terms of social media is, if you're not the kind of person who cares enough about me as an individual and wants me to care about you as an individual, that you will actually use your real photo in a family setting or with your bride in your social media, if you're just your initials, or if you're just some icon you've pulled off the internet to be a representation of you. I have Susie and I in my icon, that's who you're talking to me. And I want you to see me as me, not as my initials or as a color or as some animated GIF or GIF, we want to call it, that I pulled offline. I want you to deal with us as individuals. So I don't spend a lot of time fretting about the evil things that people say when they're hiding behind something other than the picture of their family. I just kind of say, mute, 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 mute. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Also, you know how I feel about jury selection. There are people who are so polarized. They're not in that reasonable middle who disagree, but we're reasonable. By the way, that's starting to go away. We're now not, it used to be, hey, I don't agree with you and I think you're wrong. Now it's like, I don't agree with you and you're evil for saying that. You need to be destroyed for saying that. So that's a very big polarization. And when I find that people are on the edges, I'm less likely to engage them than I am with people who are reasonable and just want to talk this over. So I don't spend a lot of, we have to pick in terms of communicating. I don't spend a lot of time trying to be provocative. But I think if we were provocative, we'd have much bigger social media profiles. But I don't think of myself as a provocative person. Yeah. That's not my goal, is to, because in the end, I'm more in that Lee Strobel mold. When I first became an apologist, Lee was like my mentor. I mean, he's the guy, just like for you, I think probably Greg Laurie, right? And so both of us would say that our first love is as an evangelist to advance the cause of the gospel. That's Lee's first love. Are we apologists? Sure. But in the end, and William Lane Craig's the same way, right? Where he'll say, hey, I want to go to those places where at some point the gospel can be preached. And we can talk about all this philosophy and all this evidence, but in the end, it is about that. What I don't want to do is to anger or divide an audience that will no longer hear the gospel from me.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I've heard William Lane Craig say, we can give an argument without being argumentative. We can give a defense without being defensive. So, I mean, I just feel like there's a lot of conversation to be had. We're trying to have it. We need to be able to talk and ask questions and express ourselves without just people rudely slamming each other down. And because I really feel like that's going to prolong the angst and the frustration and the racism until we're willing to listen, validate, try to understand, negotiate, figure out where the give and takes are. Here's a question I have for you. Have you got a chance to read up on any of the critical race theory? And if so, I am just curious as to your own thoughts on that right now.
Well, okay. So I am not, at this point, I feel like it's about your brand and your lane. Okay. I know what I'm good at.
Yeah.
And I try to stay in my lane. Right.
Yeah.
Now, there's a question you have in terms of how critical race theory fleshes out into law enforcement, into the culture that I'm in. Yes. But I feel like, this is such, when I post about I say about 700 authors. So I have a RSS feed where I'm looking at all the apologists and people who are writing a Christian worldview, and I follow all of them, all their work every day. And then I pop out into Twitter the best articles, 15 or so of the best articles that I'm not writing, my friends are writing in this field. And so I pop those onto my Twitter. I one time, what I realized is the title, just to use the expression, ends up being so divisive because people already have in their minds where they think you're going to land on.
Yeah.
And so it's like it shuts down every conversation. It's all you get when you put someone. I didn't even write the article. Now, do I agree with sometimes I don't really always agree with exactly how somebody writes something because I don't agree with anybody. I don't agree with myself most of the
time. Right.
So I mean, I just feel like, hey, it's close. At least get the discussion going. But man, there are some topics you cannot even bring up without having a firestorm of anger where no one's really talking. They're just shouting at each other.
Yeah.
So what I do is I retreat back to, is the Bible true and should we take it seriously? Because in the end, that ought to inform our theories related to race. That's the one thing. And that now I get it. I was listening to Veda yesterday, talk to Sean McDowell on his YouTube channel, and he was talking about how, there's a sense in which if you're somebody who is making a case for social issues and then you're just quiet on this one, that's a statement. But he also mentioned me by name to say, I know that Jim Wallace, he doesn't talk about those things. So, okay, I'll give him a break. Okay, well, I'm not looking for a break. Yeah. I just honestly believe that we can only, I want to solve I want to actually say something, do something that actually is constructive and helps to solve the problem. And I know it's going to be the gospel. Yeah. So the question is, how do I get people to hear that if they don't trust the Bible as true? Well, that's where our work is. Our work is in helping them cross that hurdle so they can get to the gospel. Right. Let me say one last thing about we talked about hiring. Now, I said something a minute ago. I can't remember why this triggered it for me, but this idea is law enforcement involves the word force. Law enforcement. There is some element of force. Not that I want there to be. And it's not always what you see on TV. Sometimes it's like you start a party and you've got this party planned, and somehow it gets out on the internet, and then you've got 30 people who show up who are making a mess. You don't know these people, and you're like calling the police going, hey, this is my party, but I got all these people here in my backyard who I don't know. I need you to help break it up. I need to stop the party. I need to end it. It's ruined now. I need to end it. Well, they'll call the police. Okay, that's a very common call. Party calls, we get a lot of party calls, a lot of domestic violence calls. Those kinds of calls are all the time. Well, it turns out that if you walk in to that party call and you're the first officer there and you're small of frame, they're going to respond differently. And we know that when we hire. So in that first problem, who do you let into your Facebook page? Who do you let into this group? Well, I'll guarantee you this. If you come through that door for your oral board interview and you just got released because you were the backup lineman for the New England Patriots and you have a Super Bowl ring, but you never really played in the games that much, but you are 6'6", 280 and cut like a Greek god, good chance you're going to get hired, okay? Because we know if you show up at that party call, they're going to do what you say. Now, if you show up and you're 5'6", 130 pounds, guess what's going to happen? The minute you start to feel like, whoa, you're pulling your baton out. Really? Why are you doing that? Because you already have to go in that escalation of force. You know that I can't handle this with my presence, with my voice. These are the lowest levels of force, right? Your physical presence, your voice, a command. If you need be, use your hands. Well, you realize that I'm 5'6" and 130 pounds, and I got to go to level 4. That's the problem. So we hire a lot of people we can test objectively. How many push-ups can we do? What's that tell us about his character? Nothing. And there's the problem. It's really hard. It's easy to hire the guy who can do the physical aspect of the job. It's really hard to identify whether that guy or gal has the character to do the job. Because any test I put out there, you can game it. Any set of questions, you can figure out, well, I know he wants to hear this, so I'll just say that. Doesn't mean it's true. You can do these background searches. Well, more than likely, you've already talked to the people you put down on your paper to talk to. So now it's really hard to do the condition of the heart evaluation. It's really easy to do the physical evaluation. So that's why I say we're going to have to figure out a way. And it's really, when I say it's hard, I do mean it's hard. And we make mistakes. And we get people in place and we hire these guys big because we don't want them to go to level 4 right away. We want them to stay at level 1. And then we don't know. So that's why I say you find yourself, you will have bad apples in every organization. Now the question is, have you trained them with a restrictive way of doing something? And then are you monitoring to make sure they're doing it? That's really the next step in the process, right? So it is difficult though, Bobby.
Do you feel like, I mean, obviously African Americans feel targeted by white officers. What do you make of that? Because obviously, we don't want to see anything like George Floyd. We've already talked about that. Did you feel that was the case? You worked around a lot of officers. Did you feel that there were officers that had resentment toward African Americans and would give them a harder time than need be? And, there's some justification to their point there.
Well, I think that there's bad apples in every organization. There's no doubt in my mind that there are people out there who are doing what they should not be doing when it comes to African Americans. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, what happens is in any organization, when you get hired someplace, because we are same seekers, because we are otherists, what we find ourselves doing is seeking people who have the same attitude, even about our work practices. So I might have a partner for 5 years who thinks just like me.
Yeah.
Right. So that's who I'm working with in every condition. Right. So what you see is in a large organization, if you've got thousands of police officers, there are subcultures, sometimes in substations or in divisions that are subcultures that can coexist. And are there going to be some people in those subcultures that are messed up in the head about, and it's not just about whether they're racist against blacks. Sometimes it's other groups, or sometimes it's just like, maybe they've got a problem with for whatever reason, they mistreat the homeless. There's all kinds of different ways at which you can be. Now, what I always say is, in the end, I have a body camera, and I had a body camera on me every minute I worked from the moment I became a Christ follower. It was always there. I just didn't know it was on until I realized, wow, God is watching this. And I've never really opposed body cam. Now, I can tell you, I am apprehensive a little bit about body cameras, because even as we're filming this, as we're broadcasting this, if you're watching me talk, you may not be watching what's going on next to Bobby's head. And so in any live action, there is a tunnel vision that occurs based on what it is you're focused on. And I don't want to play it back sometimes and say, well, you should have caught that thing over there. Because in real time, it happens so quickly, you might be just focused on one thing, and the camera focuses evenly on everything. So I know there are sometimes problems. I'm not convinced sometimes, for example, the body cameras really help that much. But if the officer thinks that I'm answering to something that transcends me, and if it's not a believer, maybe the thing that transcends you is that you happen to be working for the one necessary profession that is due honor. It ought to be honored. That's the thing that transcends you. If you don't do it for you, do it for you're so blessed that you get to work in this profession. Don't mess this up for everybody else. Don't mess this up for you. Honor the big thing. If you can't even honor yourself tonight, honor the big thing, because it transcends you. I'm not sure how else we get this unless we can convince people that there is a transcendent purpose over how your crummy night tonight, or how you feel about that person you shouldn't feel that way about, or whatever your situation is.
It seems like that would be really important for even morale right now. Obviously, the morale of the officers is low. You're hearing about people just pulling out. It's as if they've got to grab onto some kind of a transcendent purpose in order to withstand kind of some of their angst right now as being officers. Would you think?
You're so. Let me tell you, my son Jimmy wrote an article on our website last week, a letter to Christian brothers and sisters in law enforcement. He wrote it because he's just frustrated that he hears everybody wanting to quit. And one officer said, I'd rather take a knife stab right now than do something that's going to cost me my job. I'd rather get stabbed with a knife than respond in a way that might get misjudged. And so he's like, wow, is that where we are right now? And he's concerned about morale. He's concerned about, is that where we are? Are we at a place where we're going to lose a bunch of officers who just think it's easier to go someplace else? He wants them to remember that this is a calling, and that it's a form of worship when you are serving in this capacity, and that you need to remember the big thing, the transcendent thing. I told people yesterday, I did this small event for police officers where we're just talking about some of the issues on Saturday that are facing young police officers. I said, part of the problem too is you've got an American flag probably on your car. A lot of agencies have an American sticker on their car, American flag, or sometimes a patch on their sleeve. And now the question you want to ask is this itself such a damaged symbol? Now, I don't happen to believe it is. I'll tell you why. We get to have this conversation in America. We get to work on these issues. And you may not like the progress it takes, that it's sometimes rocky, that sometimes someone gets poked in the eye in order to do it, but we get to change if we can. We get to change. We have to have conversations about changing culture. And here's the analogy I always use. I happen to be married to a woman who has an amazing system. The way she's wired is that any mistake she might make, she quickly recalibrates. She's the most repentant person I know. And then she changes on a dime and she moves forward, and she is trying to move toward what we would call, Christian term, I hate it, sanctification, right? We're trying to get better. And because she has that, I'm like, she inspires me, because I know that her system is such that it's self-correcting. It allows for mistakes to be made, and then it tries to get better. I see America the same way. Yeah, does it have a bad past? Has it made mistakes in the past? There's no doubt about it. And there's a price to pay for history. I'm not claiming there isn't. The question is the system such that it doesn't just run over its protesters with tanks? Is the system such that it doesn't throw all of its protesters into custody? Even those who would like to say that, hey, we're having a COVID outbreak here. Are you going to be locked down or put in prison for saying that? No, we actually have a system that allows for this kind of discourse. And because we have that system that I hope is repentant going forward, that we will get better. And it's because of that system that we will get better. And so I'm not willing yet to throw it under the bus.
Hmm. That's good, bud. Here's a last question that I would have for you. And then if you've got time, we could open it up for
Yeah,
questions. If
sure.
not, we can shut it down,
No,
whatever
it's good.
works best.
We'll open up until the first person calls us a bad name. How's that?
Yeah, that's right.
That could be right away.
My last question is, since I don't know what it's like for, preparing to be an officer, is there any kind of filtering out that they try to do in the process on character to make sure that people aren't racist? That, before they pass the police academy, they've done some check to make sure they're not, or how does that work?
So you have officers who are hired. Usually they're officers. Ours are sworn officers, but sometimes they can be retired officers. So now they're civilians who are doing background studies, background checks.
Okay.
So they'll work for personnel in your agency. And if it's not a sergeant or an officer who's doing the background, it'll be a retired officer or a retired sergeant. So he understands what's involved. And that means that we're going to go out and we're going to interview pretty much everyone we can find who is in your past in any way. A neighbor, the neighbor across the street, 2 girlfriends ago, the last girlfriend. We're going to be talking to everyone we can to get a better picture of who you are. And don't think for a second we're not asking those questions.
Yeah.
The problem is that, sometimes if you're hiring on at 35, there's a lot of history that we can investigate. I hired at 27. It's harder to get hired on at 27 than if you're just right out of college at 21. Unless you did something stupid in the last 4 years in college, I mean, you're basically a kid, and then all of a sudden you're trying to hire on as a police officer. So maybe that's one of the things we have to do is to say, hey, we need a longer runway to see who people are before we hire them. But it's so hard to hire because it turns out we bounce a lot of people. I tell young people all the time, if you want to be in law enforcement, every duck needs to be in a row. It's not just have you ever been arrested or have you ever done drugs? Those are the obvious ones. Have you ever expressed a bias toward any segment of our community that will prevent you from doing the job fairly? Now that's harder to investigate.
Yeah.
But you can investigate their social media. You can do a lot of stuff now that you couldn't do before. But we also would say, have you had a relational problem? Are you somebody who's had problems in your relationships, your personal relationships, your boyfriends or girlfriends? We also get asked the question, well, are you somebody who's got a financial problem? Like you're massively in debt and you've been, because we don't want people, for example, I worked for years doing a major dope, right? When I worked in the back room, I worked in the undercover position. I was doing a lot of narcotic stuff. And you don't want a person who, has got financial problems, who's going to be in the presence of, $500,000 in cash and X number of kilos. So we're looking for all of these things. Okay. But it is hard sometimes because people sometimes don't live enough life that we can actually check, or they have the unspoken bias.
Yeah.
It is really not reflected in their words, but in who they choose to sell a car to or to buy. How do you locate that? How do you identify that? And that's the problem is that it makes it really hard to kind of sift through that. And I used to say this all the time, and Susie used to remind me how stupid this was, but I used to say, hey, if you wanted to know, one of the character issues I always want to know is simple stuff, not even the stuff that's going to eliminate. I mean, if you could check all the boxes, you think he's not a racist, he's not this, he's not that. Okay, great. But you want to know, like I always want to ask this question, hey, at the oral board, at the first oral board, tell me, young man or young lady, what have you done in the last, say, 5 years that wasn't all about you? Tell me where you served our community. It wasn't about you.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even ask that question. Most agencies, some do, but not a lot do. And what I want to hear is, if you think you're going to serve our community, if you do, you probably have already been serving our community. Show me where it is you've been serving our community. Or is this thing you want to hire on for the first time you've ever done anything like this, you want us to believe it's not? Now, my wife would always tell me, well, Jim, if that was a criteria, though, you wouldn't have got hired. And I thought, yeah, that's probably true. So maybe that bar is too high. But I'm just thinking, we've got to start to be able to figure out, like, what can we ask? What can we look at that'll give us a better picture of this problem? Now, what you'll see sometimes in behavior of police officers who go south and do something they shouldn't do is not always about race. I think what happens more with police officers after you've done the job for 10 years is you develop a more insidious kind of otherism that's not necessarily racism. It's classism. It's statusism. It's this idea that there are good guys and bad guys. Mm-hmm. And we're better than you because we don't do this kind of stuff. No one calls on our behavior. We have to constantly come and clean up your junk. And so this idea that there are good guys and bad guys. And that means that if I get there and I might do something I shouldn't do to a black citizen because I'm seeing this as a bad guy. But to be honest, if he was a white speed freak, he's going to get the same treatment because you have a problem, not so much with the otherism of race, but you're having a problem because you've worked this job so long, you're having a hard time seeing people. You have now assigned to a group what you're seeing in an individual. You're doing the same thing again. Yeah. So a lot of this might just be a matter of us having to make sure we don't let people get to that point where they're so overworked and burned out and seen so much junk that they now think that everything is junk. And they're tired of it. And they're like, you know what? It doesn't matter to me what race you are. I'm still going to treat you poorly because I am tired of this nonsense. That's, I think, probably where, if you really are honest about it, I see a lot more of that than I see of really racism toward any one group. I see a lot, and that stuff, by the way, doesn't often get reported, but the citizen walks away and thinks, why does he treat me like that? Yeah. You know, it's a car stop for a ticket and you're treated like garbage, right? Well, that doesn't make the national headlines. But why is that happening? Well, that same officer might have a problem downfield that will make it the national headlines, but that's been brewing for a while because we're starting to see that difference.
Yeah. He's lost his passion for the role that he, once had early on. He's got burnout, disillusion, and it's causing him just to be triggered everywhere he goes. And he probably just needs to step out for a while and go get.
When my dad hired on in 1961, you could hire on straight out of high school. There were not that many people in 1961 who even had college degrees, period. And certainly with law enforcement, even when I hired on with a master's degree. Okay, there was nobody else who had ever done that in our agency. So it's like, okay, now you see people all the time who will hire on with educational, with degrees, and they're much older because this generation is kind of entering the labor force later. They're getting married later. They're certainly having kids a lot later. Everything's a lot later. Yeah. And so I do think you're seeing now this we saw with George Floyd is different. I'm not sure how old that officer was, but I'm talking about the kids who are now coming up and getting hired in that 25 to 30 range. Right. I mean, those guys used to be 21. As soon as you were available, you just did some grocery job from 17 to 21. And as soon as you can get hired, you got hired. And nobody had a college degree. No one had any runway for us to look at. Very different. So I do think it will get better if for no other reason. Not that I'm saying that an education makes you better. No, I'm not saying that. Often it makes you worse, but it gives us more runway to look at to see who you really are.
Yeah. My guest has been J. Warner Wallace, my dear friend, Christian apologist, author of Forensic Faith, God's Crime Scene, amongst several other books. He is a prolific blogger, puts stuff out left and right. He could use a little bit more sleep in life. He's up early. But with that, I want to bring in Tim Hull, our executive producer. And Tim, let's ask, you probably have been seeing what's going on a lot more. Maybe you could boil it down to 2 to 3 questions that we could ask Jim before we let him go from the audience. But before we do, I just want to say I noticed some of, as I'm listening, just some of the back and forth going on. And man, I want to say it's great to see people on both sides of the spectrum, whether you're, far left, far right. My biggest plea would be just let's figure out a way that we can connect. We don't want to demonize each other. I'm so thankful. I don't care what, whether you're left or right, blue, Democrat, it doesn't matter to me. Republican, Tea Party. I mean, just we're so thankful.
Tea Party? I don't know. Is that still even a thing?
Yeah, no, I just threw out. Remember the Tea Party?
Yeah.
Libertarian, but I'm just thankful that you're here. We appreciate you listening. But boy, our tone, our passion at 1 Minute Apologists is to try to do the best we can with all of the debris to unify us. And I pray that you could share that tone with us. So that said, that just shares my heart a little bit. Tim, what are a couple questions we can throw at Jim from the audience?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of conversation going on. Again, this wasn't one specific question, but I'm trying to kind of just gather some thoughts. When you were talking about defund the police, one of kind of the overarching narratives that's going along with that is things like increasing funding for, counselors or social workers or kind of other agencies that might be able to come alongside police officers. So, Jim, maybe you could talk just a little bit about what your experience has been, on the beat, if you will, and how some of those other agencies are having maybe people come alongside would help or not help, and that wouldn't necessarily change from your experience. So that was kind of some of what they were discussing.
Yeah,
Then I have one more.
I think it's not an either or for sure. It's a both and. So I do think that I'm more than willing to try, at least to step out. You don't innovate without making mistakes. You just don't. So I'm not somebody who want to be like that, that 70-year-old guy who says, just get off my lawn. I don't want to change. I'm frigid. I think, but instead we say, I'm open for innovation. Now we got to be careful though, that we don't erode what's happening on one side to gain something on the other. So we'd have to be able to say, is this something worth our time? Because once you see if it does work, well, then we can be willing to kind of let the net. We have a net right now that is under culture that are the police forces. And again, I don't know if you guys realize this or not, but even, for example, most paramedics who are responding to a shooting will not go in until it's cleared. So you could never replace at least the force that is needed to make sure it's safe for others to do their first responder jobs without people who had an equal capacity to respond and protect and to clear. So that's going to be the problem, is that law enforcement is going to involve some aspect of force. We have to figure out what's appropriate, what kind of people will make the right choices about force use, and what biases do they hold that would eliminate them from the job. But am I open to the idea of establishing another kind of a parallel service that could help? Well, of course. And if we see it does help, then we can probably release some of the resources. But my fear would be is that this is a both and. For example, I am not somebody who says do I think that education is a big problem for young people in America? Yeah, but do I suggest we should shift everything to education? No, it's a both and. It's not an either or. Now, once you see that something is shifting toward the better, you can naturally let go of the past because you don't need that net there anymore. You've developed a new net that carries the day. But I would not shift over until I think the most reasonable thing as an administrator, as a government, would be to say, well, let's try this. Let's move in this direction. But we're not going to move away from something yet. And by the way, this does not solve the problem of reform. I mean, I think you have to look at what are we doing? What any individual officer who does something they shouldn't do, there's a long history to that person that brought them to that moment. And we need to research all of those long histories because it'll give us a lesson, a kind of a tale of warning for how we hire others. And so I think that's probably where I would spend my time right now and I get it. A lot of people will say, no, the system is so broken. And the idea that there's systemic racism in law enforcement, I have a hard time with that only because there's no systemic anything in law enforcement. That might be one of the problems. But when you have an agency, we have post-certification in California. That is the certifying agency that certifies all police officers in California, but doesn't certify people in Arizona. Different set of standards. And then once we get in that, there's a level of leeway within each agency about certain uses of force or certain ways certain grappling techniques we use. There's not one way of learning how to grapple. They teach it differently based on agency. Right. Oh my gosh. I mean, you'd have to have everyone a top-down system to argue that something is systemic. The problem I see in law enforcement is there is a systemic problem in the heart of humans. And these agencies are filled with those guys and gals. They're humans. And until we address that systemic problem in their heart, I don't know how we're going to solve the problem in the actual organization.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one kind of final question to maybe wrap this up, and you mentioned a little bit before when you said that your son wrote an article about how people were leaving. You talked a little bit about this when you were saying that people were kind of going into the workforce later. But Charles was kind of asking this question about with a number of officers retiring, where do you see the police force kind of going in the future? And again, this could be regional, it could be national. So just kind of give us maybe what some next steps might be to kind of prevent some of the issues that we're having now in the future. And then maybe where you see some of the
And are
immediate
people
solutions.
interested in being cops today?
Right,
With all
exactly.
that's
Yeah,
going on,
yeah.
so-
What happens if
Yeah.
that? So maybe just wrap it up with, again, you've kind of touched a lot of subjects throughout this whole entire conversation, but maybe just wrap it up with what your thoughts are in the future.
I will tell you, I'm not incredibly optimistic, but are cyclical, and it'll cycle, and I don't know what will trigger the next cycle. When I say trigger, I mean either it'll be a matter of people seeing this as a noble profession again that they see as a calling. Here's how my son always puts it. He grew up watching his dad put on a uniform every day, and he also grew up a huge fan of superheroes, DC and Marvel. Okay. What he always says is he wishes that we could be superheroes and be loved, be like the Avengers. If you've watched the Avengers series, they all get together. Everyone goes, woohoo, Captain America's here. And he saves New York City. It's awesome. Right? That's not, unfortunately, what we're at. Police officers today are not like the Avengers. They're like the X-Men. Distrusted. Don't think I want those anywhere around us. Don't want them in our country. Want them out of here. Right. But in the end, somehow Professor X has convinced these guys they need to save the world. And when they do, it'll either be completely anonymously, or it'll be like, okay, great, but get out of here. We still don't like you. Okay. So I always, if you're going to do this job now, you're going to have to be like the X-Men and not like the Avengers. If you can be the X-Men and realize that you're never going to be popular, but this is worth doing. But it has to be done a way that transcends. Let me just say something. Culture changes on the base of shame. When you are ashamed of how you've behaved, you will change it. I can't ever forget that picture of the little girl who was being walked up to the school accompanied by a National Guardsman, a little black girl who was like in Arkansas being walked up to that school because she could not go there safely on her own in a segregated school. If you don't feel a sense of national shame, that picture was worth 1 billion influential words.
Right.
And what we have to do is, but at the same time, if you do something shameful on either side of this, then the other side says, look at those guys. They should be ashamed of themselves. Both of us on both sides of this divide need to stop doing the things that anyone could say they ought to be ashamed for that. And what we have to do is recognize our own responsibility and feel a sense of personal shame for where we stand on issues. And if we do that, we will have a trajectory toward healing. And then, yes, law enforcement will become populated again because it'll be with people who see themselves as doing something that's bigger than themselves. It's not about, we hire people all the time. We say, hey, come on over here. We have the best hours. You're going to get flexible shifts. We pay more than anybody else in the county. Really? That's why you want this job? For the money, the shifts, or the flexibility? Trust me, a time is coming when you're going to feel underpaid. The sergeant's going to deny you your shifts. You're not going to get your vacation. And suddenly you're going to be upset because that's why you came over here. No.
Right.
If they paid you nothing, would you do this for free? Do you think this is important enough that you would do this for free? That's the guy we want to hire. Somebody who says, yeah, I think this is such a noble cause that even though it's going to be an X-Men experience and not an Avengers experience, I'm in. And if we have people like that, we will get better.
Assuming that they have $1 million in the bank and they can afford to do it for free.
Oh, you better marry a rich spouse.
Right.
Then you can do this one.
Right.
Hey, Jim, is there anything, Tim, I appreciate you asking Jim those questions. And I would just say, is there anything that you feel like we've left on the table? I know that we might have missed something with you.
Well, I think that there's a lot we left on the table. But that's okay, because I think that this format is better. Frank and I, you know Frank Turk as well. We love Frank, and he's got a radio show that we did last Saturday. And to try to do this in 5, 10 to 12 minute segments with breaks where you can't even continue a thought is about impossible. This is far better because it allows us to do it without interruption. But we're going to leave things out. That's why here's the danger, Bobby. Is this the kind of thing we're going to talk about right now? And then we're going to check this box. And when the news cycle flips tomorrow on some other issue on social media, we're never going to come back to this. Is that what's going to happen?
Let's hope not.
Let's hope not. But my fear is that, so if it is the kind of thing we're just going to walk away from and never do it again, well, then we didn't really cover enough. But if it's the kind of thing we're going to revisit, well, then we have more opportunities to talk about what I would say is the problem of otherism.
Yeah.
That's something we have to work on constantly, even if it isn't. And what I see, honestly, is you'll see more crime on crime, like is about otherism, than you will see about any other form of otherism.
Hey, that would be a good book title, Jim. A Case for Otherism.
Well, yeah, that's why I did this series called Bridging the Thin Blue Line. And that was my basic argument. Now, what I hear people say, and we're done, but what I hear people say is that, hey, you cannot retreat back to the larger sin without being specific to racism. And I agree. I think that we have to, how it's expressing itself in this cultural moment is the issue of racism. And we need to have our hearts broken about that. We need, both sides have to find that thing that they can feel appropriate shame about. Because both sides, no one's clean on this. And then we have to be ashamed of each other, ashamed of ourselves. And that's when, how many times when you have an argument with your wife, at some point you just feel ashamed of yourself for even going there, and she does too. And then you come back to it and you heal. We have to have that cultural moment right now.
So, Jim, where would you point people to go to learn more about you?
Well, I mean, my website's coldcasechristianity.com, but I tried to post on the YouTube page, our YouTube page, in the second playlist is the series on Bridging the Thin Blue Line, which really has a lot of the things we've talked about, just made visual. And the idea here is that everyone wants to contribute to this conversation. And I think it's time for us to do that and not let it be a one-time. This is why I don't usually participate, and you probably don't either, Bobby, in whatever that one thing they want you to do on social media that day, like to check a box. I'm not interested in virtue signaling on this. I'm interested in, can we sustain a longer conversation? Yeah. So you'll see that video. You can comment on that video on my YouTube page.
Well, I appreciate you, being with us today, Jim. I want to encourage those that our first time, followers here today. Make sure you go and subscribe, like, and share our channel at 1 Minute Apologists. Let other people know. Also be sure to check out our YouTube channel. I've had Jim on many times where he's answered a whole plethora of questions on the program. So
I think we have a playlist, actually. We have a Jim Wallace playlist put together that you can just sit and watch.
Good.
Like 45 minutes of.
So embarrassing. I mean, have you ever transcribed our conversations, Bobby? I had several of them transcribed. On paper, I sound like the idiot I probably am. Because when we're talking like this, we're not presenting literature. We're just talking. It is not true. But I think the videos are effective though. So
absolutely. Yeah. You always do such a great job. And I'm looking forward to speaking at the conference with you in August in Texas, hoping that it doesn't get canceled.
I know
with COVID, but I do look forward to being with you there. I just would want to say to the audience, let's all remember that at the end of the day, our hope is in Jesus Christ. If you don't have a personal relationship with Jesus, know that he came, fulfilled the moral law that we all broke, died on a cross for us, rose from the grave, and by faith and trust in him, we can have our sins forgiven and we can enter into a relationship. And the beautiful thing about the cross is at the cross, the ground is level and we can love one another regardless of our differences. And sometimes our differences are big and sometimes our differences are petty, but either way, in heaven, I'm so thankful for that vision whereby we can walk hand in hand. We won't have to spend time in conversations like this in a glorified state, but in a broken world, we do. And I'm thankful, Jim, for your passion to help turn this brokenness into something beautiful.
Thanks, Bobby, for having me. I appreciate it. You're absolutely right. The gospel cure. The gospel doesn't just cure us of our sins, pay for our sins. The gospel actually transforms us. And we understand as image bearers that we are to love other image bearers. So I think this is why the gospel is the cure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tim, any final words before we?
Nope. That's it, man.
Thanks, Tim.
All right.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. God bless you all. Peace out.